use prison or something, and I'm not in favor of that. Um, but in terms of the lower level stuff, a lot of it is very vexatious. A lot of it is actually hurts people. A lot of it does create victims. If there is a repeat offense of these lower level things, and the reparative boards are not getting a response out of these people, and the system, then they need to come into the criminal justice system. Within that context, I'm not saying that everybody who comes into the criminal justice system is going to have to do time in jail or something like that. There are a lot of different ways that a case can be resolved, including going back to the reparative system if it's deemed appropriate. But I do think that cases where there is a repeat disturbance in quality of life has to, if it's repeated, it has to come into the criminal justice system, because the people who are being disturbed are real people too, and they need to be protected.
Thank you. A similar question about lower level offenses. There's significant reason to believe that some police are targeting BIPOC community members using non-safety related reasons to stop drivers. Um, the Chittenden County office currently has a policy that such stops will presumptively result in declining to prosecute, as they're connected to racial bias. Would you at a minimum maintain that current policy, or would you have a different approach?
Me?
Yes.
No, I would not maintain that policy. The reason I would not maintain, I understand the intent of it, and the intent is a good intent to combat the actual racism that is the stats show. I believe it's an implied racism. I want to say something about that. I have experience with BIPOC people, in as much as my family is half BIPOC. I have learned through personal painful experience that I believe we all have inherent racism. We all have implicit bias. So it's not surprising that these numbers are going to be different and bad. The question is what you do about it. And the problem with the policy, as I see it, is that the Vermont State Police say that 40% of their DUI cases that they arrest happen from cases where they didn't have any indicia that the person was drunk when they pulled them over. In other words, a non-public safety motor vehicle stop. That is a huge percentage of DUI cases that are going to be left on the road, and that's a huge public safety issue. So I think it's a real issue. It's got to be addressed. I don't believe that policy is the way to do it. I think it goes too far, and I think we need to try a lot more training, consistent training, a pattern of training over and over again, and continual monitoring of this issue. And if we're not making progress, then I will find some other way, because it's a real issue and it does need to be resolved.
Thank you, Ted. Sarah, will you retain the policy of not charging cases based on non-safety traffic stops?
Yes, of course. I spent a lot of time researching and developing and implementing the policy. I believe in it. I believe it is an actual action that will and does result in less people of color coming into the system. I cannot control what the police do, but I can, when I saw the disparities and how many of those were leading to drug charges on people of color versus white counterparts, I realized there was something I could do about it. And that's where the policy came from. We do still look at every single case that is sent to us. Some of them we are declining, and there are some that we have continued through and made a decision to charge regardless. It is a presumption to decline. It is not a blanket declination of all charges.
Thank you. We heard a little bit earlier about the opioid crisis that's happening here. So Vermont is unprecedented rate of deadly overdose occurring. There has been talk about overdose prevention sites where people can use their own drugs in view of medical personnel ready to do life-saving work. This has been implemented in other locations around the world. Would you support the opening of overdose prevention here in Vermont? That's to you first, Sarah.
Thank you. Yes, wholeheartedly. Again, in 2017, one of the first things I did as state's attorney was to get together a commission of experts in our community, both made up of people who serve folks who are suffering from substance use disorder, people who have used, people in recovery, law enforcement, and others, to determine whether or not safe consumption sites were something that Vermont should consider, and specifically Chittenden County should consider, given our overdose numbers at the time. The report that was written by this commission was overwhelmingly and resoundingly in support of it, and I was one of the first to openly endorse and call on our community as well as state legislature to pass a bill allowing them. And I've been working since on several committees with the mayor's office and with other advocates in the community to find ways that, with even without the legislation, we can open a safe consumption space similar to what New York City has done recently and found wild success and a significant amount of lives saved.
Thank you. Ted, do you support the opening of overdose prevention sites in Vermont?
I wish I had a blanket answer one way or the other now, because it would be probably better for me in terms of how I'm perceived, but I don't. The harm reduction has to occur. Too many people are dying, and too many people are overdosing, and then even if they don't die, that's still a terrible thing to go through. Too many people are using these drugs and are destroying themselves and their family lives. And if we can do something to prevent overdoses, then I'm in favor of it. The reason I'm not sure about this is because it is a vast public policy decision to make. The weighing things like this will require weighing whether we put new dollars into it or not. I imagine that we would have to. And if those dollars are being used there, they're not being used somewhere else. Other questions that arise, like how are these people going to get home, and how are we going to make sure that they don't drive or something like that when we don't have a big public transportation system in Vermont? When we had to get an ambulance service in the town of Williston, we initially said no because there were other things that we had to spend the money on. And as I said then, if I have a crisis going on in my house that needs an ambulance, I want 9 ambulances in town. But public policy is never as simple as just saying, okay, let's get this done and taken care of. What other cost benefit is there going to be? What other opportunities are not going to be funded? And how is it going to be administered in terms of making sure everybody's safe?
Thank you, Ted. I want to start with you again on this one. There are when folks are released with conditions, there are some challenges specific to our homeless community. For example, it is common to request a curfew as a condition of release, but it would be difficult for a person who is homeless to abide by. Do you believe it's appropriate to not request conditions of release based on a person's status of housing?
Me?
Yes.
Okay. It's a very tough moment. It depends, as with so many things, about what specific crime we're talking about and the characteristics of the person. I have a huge place in my heart for the homeless. I've shared in this campaign, I've shared out throughout my entire life that we had 8 kids in my family. 2 of my brothers were diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia after they did a lot of drugs in college. Chicken or the egg, I don't know what caused what. But I do know that my oldest brother ended up being homeless, and while he was homeless, ended up being murdered in Central Park in New York City. The homeless are real people. That's somebody's brother, and I don't want to keep somebody in jail who is somebody's brother and who in many ways is my brother, if there is another way to do it. But where the situation arises where there is a repeat offense over and over and over again, then reluctantly that does have to be considered, and it does have to be requested of the court. So if somebody is doing, committing a crime over and over again, then after a while, the weighing of homelessness versus the weighing of threat to the public or vexation to the public begins to shift, and a advocacy for a condition of release with a curfew would have to be made.
Thank you, Ted. Sarah, same question. Would you release folks experiencing homelessness without condition?
Thank you. So I would say that conditions of release are different for every case. It doesn't necessarily, I wouldn't say that anybody who's homeless doesn't get conditions of release. Each person and their individual circumstances are what we take into account, and what they're charged with and what the law allows for. I don't think curfews for people who are homeless are helpful. I think that they're set up for failure, and that most of those folks will be arrested within a day for something that they have no control over. But there's other ways, we have in some cases with people who are homeless, to make sure that they continue to come to court. We have them check in at the public defender's office, for example, or check in with their attorney, understanding that a lot of them don't have phones either. So we have to sometimes find different ways to make sure that people are staying engaged with their service providers or their pretrial monitor if we've connected them with one of those. There are a lot of other ways that we can try to address the issues and make sure that people and folks are either staying in touch with their attorney or coming to court. A curfew for a particular homeless person, I don't personally think is all that helpful. Some people are in hotels, and that hotel is changing every week. So that can sometimes lead, again, to sort of setup for them. But does it mean we've never done it? Probably not. I'm sure we have. And in some cases, it's probably worked. And in some cases, I'm sure it hasn't.
Thank you for that. So starting with you again, Sarah. Chittenden County is home to the largest immigrant communities in Vermont. As state's attorney, would you be willing to put into policy or train and direct your prosecutors to consider the immigration consequences of a conviction?
Yes, I actually have. I have a racial equity policy, and part of that policy it directs deputy state's attorneys to consider collateral consequences for anybody that they are prosecuting. But it does, of course, for obvious reasons, more likely impact our new American population and other racial groups more than otherwise. So yes, I not only would, but I have.
And Ted, would you continue that policy, having staff consider the consequences of immigration during each stage of a case?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. I think that needs to happen because the collateral consequences of in every case have to be considered. Otherwise, it becomes just rote, and that leads to injustice, particularly for the immigrant community, where the consequence of certain convictions is massive. It's a discretionary process, so a lot of times that will carry the day, but sometimes it won't. But the short answer is generally yes.
Thank you. And I think there's time for one more question before we do closing. And so I'll start with you, Ted. How do you intend to create equity between BIPOC defendants and indigent clients with white defendants of means? And what steps have you taken to implement policies that would address this?
Well, I'm not state's attorney yet, so I haven't taken any steps for that. It's a real issue. Here's the difficulty. Taking into consideration somebody's race is frankly just unconstitutional. It violates the Equal Protection Clause of the federal Constitution. It violates the Common Benefits Clause of the state Constitution. And taking those things into account can cut in so many different ways. Somebody can say that I wasn't treated fairly because I had a more harsh consequence because of my race, because I'm white, or because I'm Black or Asian. But it's a deeper thing than that. There's such a thing as inherited wealth, and there's such a thing as inherited poverty. Unfortunately, the legacy of racism in the United States and in Vermont and in Chittenden County and in our hearts has led to inherited poverty for a lot of BIPOC members of the BIPOC community. That and their circumstances, their education, the other life experiences they've had absolutely has to be taken into account. Because if you don't, then again, it just becomes rote, and ultimately it can lead to cruel consequences.
Thank you, Ted. And Sarah, how do you intend to create equity between BIPOC defendants and indigent clients? What steps have you taken to implement policies?
So I think, most of my policies are indirectly have that impact. My cash bail policy, for example, when I implemented that policy, we ran a list, got a list from DOC about how many people are being held on cash bail from Chittenden County. And every single one of them had a public defender. None of them had a private attorney. And a disproportionate amount of them were people of color. So when I implemented the cash bail policy, not only does that address the wealth issue, but it also addresses the race issue. When I did the non-public safety stop policy, of course, that might also benefit white people, but the data shows that it will also and more often benefit people of color in our community. So a lot of those policies have that indirect impact because of our data and our disproportionate prison population and our disproportionate policing that we have in our community. Another thing that we've done is our DUIs are probably one of the most likely cases to be represented by private attorneys versus public defenders. And we found with prior administration, when I was a deputy state's attorney, I found that a lot of private attorneys were essentially buying their clients out of probation. So when we would have an offer of probation, they would just ask, and we would agree often to a higher fine in place of that. We no longer do that.
Thank you so much for that. We are nearing the end of our time. I'll give you a minute to share a closing statement. Sarah, you're first.
Thank you, and thank you again for hosting. I'm so impressed that you got it done in half an hour. I'm the state's attorney. I'm running for re-election because I believe we have a lot more work to do. For the last 5.5 years, I have worked tirelessly to not only do this job, I have a full caseload. I believe in this work, but also to disrupt the status quo and dismantle a system that is the foundation of which is racist and classist, and actually take steps, not just saying certain things and talking the talk, but actually take real steps to address those underlying issues and attempt to dismantle a system that oppresses people in our community, mostly people of color, and causes more harm than it does good. I believe we have a lot more work to do. I am asking for people to vote for me on August 9th so we can continue to build a true public safety system and a more just system for all.
Thank you so much, Sarah George. Ted, you're up with your closing last word.
Thank you. And thank you for hosting, and thank you everybody who's watching. I'm running for state's attorney because I do believe that we have new challenges. I believe that they are caused by fundamentally COVID and economic upheaval and the race and economic tensions that resulted from the last 5 years. The question is, what do we do about it? And I believe that we need new policies to address that. I do not believe that we need to go back to old policies. I do not believe in mass incarceration or automatic jail sentences. I stood next to people in federal court who were being victimized racially by mandatory minimums and sentencing guidelines that were absolute. I don't believe in absolutes. I believe that justice is almost always an exercise in exceptions. I believe that we can do better than we're doing now, but I also believe that that the heart of the law is mercy, and we need to show compassion. I just believe that we can show compassion and the more firmness that the new issues require. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you. Thank you for joining tonight. Thank you to Town Meeting TV for hosting and those folks who submitted questions. Don't forget to vote in the primary August 9th. Early voting by mail or in person is available now by contacting your town clerk's office. Polls will be open August 9 from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Thank you for watching.